Billy Thatcher bought the old barn for exactly $1. The seller, a man with eyes that never quite met his, insisted on cash. He counted the crumpled bill twice, his lips moving silently, then shoved it into a worn leather pouch. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't bother with paperwork. He just pressed a single rusted key into Billy's palm and gave him a piece of advice that would echo in his head for days. Don't dig where the boards creak loudest. Then the man, Ezra Whitmore, turned and walked away, disappearing over the rise without a single look back. It was the strangest transaction of Billy's life, and he'd only been back in the territory for a week. He stood there, key in hand, watching the dust settle. The barn was a skeleton against the skyline, a relic that should have collapsed a generation ago. But something was off. As he got closer, he saw it. Fresh nails, their heads still glinting in the afternoon sun, had been hammered into the rotting planks. New rope, clean and strong, secured the main doors that sagged on ancient hinges. Someone had been taking care of this place. It hadn't been abandoned at all. It had been maintained. His dog, a scruffy mutt named Copper, seemed to know it too. The dog circled the barn 3 times, its nose to the ground, whimpering softly. It wasn't a bark of aggression, but a low, mournful sound of fear. Something in this place was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Billy pushed open the heavy doors, the new rope groaning in protest. Inside, the air was still and thick, tasting of old hay and something else, something metallic and cold. It was too quiet, too clean. The floor was swept, the cobwebs cleared from the corners. It looked less like an abandoned barn and more like a stage waiting for actors. He walked toward the center, his boots echoing in the cavernous space. The floorboards were a strange patchwork, a mix of old, weathered gray wood and newer, lighter planks. They were arranged in a pattern that made no structural sense, an alternating design that seemed almost decorative. He remembered Whitmore's words. Don't dig where the boards creak loudest. He stepped on a dozen different boards. They all creaked. They moaned and groaned under his weight, all except one. Right in the very center of the barn, a large, dark beam of wood. When Billy put his full weight on it, it didn't creak. It didn't make a sound. It echoed. A deep, hollow boom resonated from beneath his feet, as if he were standing on a drum. In that exact instant, Copper began to scratch. The dog went into a frenzy, claws tearing at that silent beam, whining with an urgency that sent a shiver down Billy's spine. Billy dropped to his knees, pushing the frantic dog aside. He ran his fingers over the wood. It was smoother than the rest, worn down by something other than the weather. And then he saw them. Nail holes, dozens of them. But they had been filled with a dark putty, then smoothed over. Someone had taken great care to hide them. But what was impossible was that the wood around the holes was worn smooth, as if from years and years of foot traffic, of being lifted and replaced time and time again. Someone hadn't just been in this barn. They had been opening this floor. Often. Billy pulled his hunting knife from its sheath and worked the tip into a thin crack. The wood groaned, then lifted. It wasn't a board. It was a door. A heavy, concealed trap door. He heaved it open, revealing a square of perfect, black emptiness. A wooden ladder descended into the darkness. But the strangest part wasn't the hidden door his dog had found, or the ladder leading to God knows where. It was the dirt. As he leaned over the hole, a few clumps of soil from his boots fell into the darkness below. And he realized the dirt on his boots was fresh, dark, rich soil. But his own land was dry, dusty clay. He hadn't been anywhere else. He looked down at his boots, then at the barn floor, then back at his boots. The dirt wasn't from his property. He hadn't brought it in with him. Which meant only one thing. He'd picked it up after he'd come inside. He looked back at the open trapdoor. He hadn't been down there yet. But the dirt on his boots said otherwise. A cold dread washed over him. He thought he'd bought an old barn for $1. A place to store his gear, to get out of the rain. What he'd actually purchased was a secret. Someone else's dark, buried secret. And whoever that someone was, they had been here very, very recently. Billy took a deep breath, the stale air filling his lungs. He had to know. He grabbed his lantern from his saddlebag, lit the wick, and started down the ladder. Each rung was thick and sturdy, groaning under his weight but holding firm. The air grew colder with every step, the smell of damp earth replacing the hay and dust from above. The lantern cast a small circle of flickering light, pushing back a darkness that felt ancient and absolute. He reached the bottom and stood on a packed earth floor. The tunnel stretched out before him, disappearing into the blackness beyond his lantern's reach. It wasn't a root cellar. It was a passage, carved with a precision that spoke of months, maybe even years, of careful hidden labor. The walls were smooth, the ceiling arched. This was the work of someone who knew what they were doing. Papers were scattered across the floor, rustling as he walked past. He bent down and picked one up. It wasn't trash. It was a land deed, bearing an official-looking seal and a flourish of signatures. He picked up another and another. There were dozens of them. His hands began to tremble as he recognized the property descriptions. These documents covered nearly half the county. He saw the Miller farm, the Rodriguez ranch, properties belonging to families he'd known his whole life. Families who had been forced to sell out under mysterious circumstances over the past decade. Bad luck, people had called it, a string of misfortunes. But this wasn't bad luck. This was a conspiracy. Something was wrong with every single deed. He held them closer to the lantern. The signatures, despite bearing different names, were all written in the same distinctive hand. The dates had been tampered with, the original ink carefully scraped away and rewritten with a darker shade. And then his blood ran cold. He saw his own family's name, a deed for a parcel of land up by the North Ridge, signed with the name William Thatcher, his father. Billy had never known they owned that land. His father had never mentioned it. The signature was a forgery, a crude imitation of his father's handwriting. His dog, Copper, was still at the top of the ladder, pacing back and forth, its anxious whimpering echoing down into the tunnel. The sound grew more urgent as Billy walked deeper into the passage. The tunnel was wide, easily wide enough for 2 or 3 men to walk abreast. Support beams made of freshly cut lumber had been installed every few feet. He could still see the marks from the saw. This tunnel wasn't just old, it was actively being used. 20 feet in, the tunnel split, branching off into 3 separate directions. Someone had carved symbols into the earthen wall at the junction, simple markings that looked like crude property lines. One of them, a circle with a cross through it, was identical to a marking he'd seen branded on his father's old saddle. He'd always thought it was just a decoration. Now he knew it was a symbol, a secret code. The tunnel on the left was blocked. A recent cave-in had filled the passage with loose dirt and splintered timbers. But it didn't look like an accident. The collapse was too neat. The dirt piled up too deliberately. Fresh tool marks scarred the remaining support beams. Someone had destroyed this passage on purpose, burying whatever was down there in a hurry. They hadn't just hidden something. They had erased it. Billy chose the tunnel on the right. It led him into a larger chamber, about the size of a small cabin. A makeshift office had been set up inside. A rough table made from sawhorses and planks was covered in stacks of letters, receipts, and surveyor's maps. On a crate in the corner sat an inkwell, a pen, and a small metal box. Billy opened the box. It was filled with official-looking seals, the kind used by county clerks and notaries. Forgeries. Every single document on the table was signed by the same man. Ezra Whitmore. The name hit Billy like a punch to the gut. Ezra Whitmore. The man who sold him the barn for $1. The man with the shifty eyes and the strange warning. The man who counted that single crumpled bill as if it were a fortune. It wasn't a sale. It was a transfer. A passing of the torch, whether Billy wanted it or not. His hands shook as he rifled through Whitmore's papers. They laid out the entire scheme in cold, methodical detail. A systematic plan to forge property deeds, to intimidate landowners with threats and manufactured debts, to redistribute the entire territory among a small group of conspirators. He saw names he recognized, respected names, businessmen from town, county officials, even Thomas Wickham, the banker who had foreclosed on so many families, including his father's closest friends. They were all in on it. But one letter, tucked at the bottom of a stack, made his heart stop. It was addressed to Whitmore. It was dated just 3 days ago. The handwriting was jagged, panicked. Thatcher's son is back. He bought the barn. If he finds what's underneath, we're all dead men. They knew he was here. They had been watching him. The sale of the barn wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap. Billy crushed the letter in his fist, the paper crackling in the silence. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. They hadn't just sold him a barn, they'd put a target on his back. His father's death 3 years ago, the official report called it a tragic riding accident, suddenly felt like anything but an accident. Had his father found this tunnel? Had he uncovered this same evidence? And had they silenced him for it? Just then, from above ground, Copper's barking changed. It was no longer an anxious whine. It was a vicious, aggressive roar. Someone was here. Billy instantly doused his lantern, plunging the chamber into absolute blackness. He held his breath, straining to listen. Hoofbeats, multiple horses arriving outside the barn. Voices carried down through the floorboards, muffled by the earth and wood, but the urgency in their tone was unmistakable. The dog's here, but where's Thatcher? The voice was gravelly, impatient, a voice he didn't recognize. Maybe he went to town. We searched the barn first, then the house. He can't have gone far. This second voice made Billy's stomach clench into a knot of ice. He knew that voice. He'd heard it every Sunday of his life, delivering sermons about morality and justice. It was Reverend Marcus Hollis, the most respected, most trusted man in the entire territory. And he was one of them. The preacher was part of the conspiracy. Billy scrambled to gather as many documents as he could, stuffing the deeds and the letters inside his shirt. The papers crinkled with every movement, each sound magnified 100 times in the suffocating silence. He had to get out, but the only way out was the ladder. The ladder that was directly beneath the spot where the men were now standing. He could hear their heavy boots scraping across the floorboards right above him. They were moving around, searching. "Look at this," another voice said, closer now. "Scratches on the floor, right here, deep ones." "Something's been digging," Hollis replied, his voice tight with a tension Billy had never heard from the pulpit. "Looks recent. It's just the dog," the first voice grumbled. "Animals dig. It don't mean anything." But the uncertainty was there. They were suspicious. Billy pressed himself flat against the cold earthen wall of the tunnel as the footsteps moved directly over the trap door. Through the tiny gaps between the planks, he could see their shadows passing back and forth. 3 men. No, 4. And judging by the metallic clinking that accompanied their movements, they were all armed. Copper's barking grew more frantic, more desperate. The dog knew he was in danger. Then came a sound that made Billy's blood turn to ice, the sharp, distinctive click of a hammer being pulled back on a pistol. "Shut that animal up," the gravelly voice commanded. "Permanent!" "No," Hollis ordered, his voice a sharp whisper. "No gunshots. Too much noise. Use the rope." Billy's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. They were going to kill his dog. They were going to hang his only friend to keep him quiet. Copper had been his only companion since his father died, the only living thing that had stayed by his side when the world fell apart. But what could he do? If he climbed that ladder to save his dog, he would be walking directly into their guns. He had seconds to decide. Let them murder the only innocent soul in this whole rotten business, or reveal himself and die alongside him. The choice wasn't a choice at all. He couldn't let them harm that dog. He had to create a diversion. Something loud, something that would draw them away from the trap door, give him and Copper a chance to escape. His eyes scanned the dark chamber. He picked up a heavy, jagged rock from the floor, hefting it in his hand. He looked back toward the junction, toward the 3 branching tunnels. His gaze fell on the leftmost passage, the one that had been deliberately collapsed. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in his mind. He took a running start and hurled the rock with all his might down that blocked tunnel. It sailed through the darkness and slammed into the pile of loose dirt and splintered wood. The impact echoed through the underground network, amplified and distorted by the confined space. The sound that reached the surface wasn't a crash. It was a deep, guttural rumbling, as if the very earth beneath the barn was groaning in protest. Above him, the voices stopped. The footsteps froze. "What in the hell was that?" one of them whispered, his voice trembling. "Something's moving down there," Hollis hissed. But Billy had made a terrible miscalculation. The noise hadn't scared them away. It had confirmed their deepest fears. They no longer had to wonder if someone was in the tunnel. Now they knew, and they were coming down. Billy heard the sharp crack of wood being pried up. They had found the trap door. A heavy boot hit the top rung of the ladder, testing its strength before the man committed his full weight. 30 seconds. He had maybe 30 seconds before they were on him. The middle passage, the one he hadn't explored, was his only hope. He scrambled toward it, clutching the stolen documents against his chest. Behind him, a beam of lantern light sliced through the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. The first man was already halfway down. "Careful now," Hollis called from above. "Could be a trap." "Ain't no trap," the man on the ladder grunted back. "Just some damn fool who don't know when to leave well enough alone." The middle tunnel sloped steeply upward, the walls rougher and more jagged than the main passage. Billy's boots slipped on the loose dirt as he climbed, sending a shower of small stones clattering down behind him. The sound was a betrayal, a clear signal of his location. But he had no choice. He had to keep moving. Behind him, he heard boots hit the tunnel floor. "Spread out. Check every passage. He can't have gone far." Billy flattened himself against the wall, holding his breath as the lantern beam swept across the junction below. The light paused, lingering for a terrifying second on the entrance to his tunnel. He was sure they'd seen him. But then, the light moved on. They were checking the other passages first, the ones that looked more promising. He didn't wait. He pushed himself upward, crawling on his hands and knees. The tunnel went on for another 20 feet before he saw it, a faint circle of gray light. Daylight. He scrambled the last few feet and emerged from the earth, gasping for fresh air. He was behind a large cluster of rocks, about 200 yards from the barn. The exit was perfectly concealed, a dark slash in the earth hidden by overgrown sagebrush. From his new vantage point, he could see everything. 4 horses were tied to a post near the barn entrance. A 5th man, a guard, stood beside them, scanning the surrounding fields. And Copper. His dog was still alive, tied to a fence post, the rope tight around his neck. The animal had stopped barking but was on high alert, its ears pricked, its eyes locked on the barn. When Copper saw Billy emerge from the rocks, he let out a soft whine but didn't bark. The smart animal knew they were still in danger. Billy counted them again. 5 men in total. Too many to fight, especially when they were all armed and he had nothing but a knife. He recognized 3 of the horses now. One belonged to Ezra Whitmore. Another, a distinctive gray mare, belonged to Sheriff Dale Morrison. And the third, a powerful black stallion, was banker Thomas Wickham's prize horse. The conspiracy wasn't just a few greedy men. It was the law. It was the bank. It was the church. It was the entire power structure of the territory. They owned everything. A muffled shout echoed from the tunnel entrance. "Found something! Looks like a damn office down here. He's been using this place regular." "Any sign of Thatcher?" Hollis called back from the surface. "Not yet, but he was here. These papers on the table are still warm from his lantern." Billy cursed under his breath. They'd found the chamber, and worse, they knew he'd been there just moments ago. They would know he had taken some of the documents. The evidence crumpled against his chest suddenly felt like a lead weight. It was the truth, the key to bringing them all down. But it was also his death warrant if he couldn't get away. The guard by the horses was growing restless, pacing back and forth. Billy needed a bigger distraction, something that would pull all 5 of them away from the barn, away from his dog, away from the tunnel exits. But what could one man do against 5 when those 5 controlled everything? And then he remembered the blocked tunnel, the one that had been deliberately collapsed. Whatever they had buried down there was important enough to destroy a passage, to risk sealing themselves in. What could possibly be that valuable? Or that dangerous? Billy began to circle wide around the barn, keeping low, using the rolling hills and scrub brush for cover. The collapsed tunnel had been sealed from the inside. That meant someone had sacrificed their own escape route to bury whatever was in there. That wasn't just caution. That was desperation. Which meant there had to be another way out. The tunnel's original entrance had to be somewhere nearby. He scanned the landscape, his eyes searching for any subtle sign of disturbance, any place where the ground didn't look quite right. And there it was. 50 yards past the barn, a slight depression in the earth, barely noticeable. The grass in that one spot grew differently, a shade greener, a little thicker than the surrounding prairie. He crept toward it, his ears tuned to the sounds from the barn. The men were still searching the tunnels below, their angry, frustrated voices echoing up through the main entrance. Sheriff Morrison's voice carried clearly now, laced with fury. "Whitmore, you swore to me nobody else knew about this place." "Nobody did know," came Whitmore's defensive reply. "That side passage has been sealed for 2 years. There's no way anyone could have found it." "Then you explain how Thatcher's boy got down there," Banker Wickham demanded. "You explain those papers he took." Billy reached the depression and dropped to his knees. He started digging with his bare hands, tearing at the grass and soil. The earth was loose, recently disturbed despite the cover of grass. 6 inches down, his fingers hit wood. A trapdoor. This one was older than the one in the barn, the wood weathered and gray, but the hinges were well oiled. It wasn't locked. Billy lifted it slowly, carefully, revealing another dark hole, another ladder leading down. This had to be it. The second entrance to the blocked tunnel. Someone had come in this way, collapsed the tunnel to hide something, and then escaped, sealing the entrance behind them. He didn't hesitate. He descended quickly into the darkness. This tunnel felt different, older, more dangerous. The air was heavy with the smell of decay. The passage was partially collapsed, just as he had seen from the other side, but a narrow crawl space remained open near the ceiling. He had to get on his belly, pushing himself forward with his elbows, the loose dirt raining down on his back with every inch he gained. The space was suffocatingly tight. On the other side of the collapse, his lantern revealed what they had tried so desperately to hide. Bodies. 3 of them. They were skeletons now, picked clean by time and the creatures of the earth, still dressed in the tattered remnants of their clothing. These weren't ancient remains. The leather on their boots was still intact, the bones not yet fully weathered. They had died within the last few years. One skeleton was slumped against the wall, a dark hole in its skull. The other 2 lay nearby, and on the wrist of one of them something glinted in the lantern light, a silver watch, tarnished but unmistakable. Billy felt the air leave his lungs. He would know that watch anywhere. It was his father's, the one he was wearing the day he died, the one that was supposedly lost in the accident. His father hadn't died falling from a horse. He had been murdered, executed down here in this hole, along with two other men who had stumbled upon the truth. Billy's hands shook so badly he could barely hold the lantern. He forced himself to search his father's remains. In the rotted inner pocket of his coat, he found it. A small, leather-bound notebook, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. He opened it. His father's neat, steady handwriting filled the pages. Names, dates, property descriptions. William Thatcher had been investigating the land fraud for months. He had documented everything. Every forged signature, every stolen acre, every family they had ruined. The final entry was dated the day before he was killed. Meeting Whitmore tomorrow at the old barn. Have proof of everything. Time to end this. A folded piece of paper fell from between the pages. Billy unfolded it. It was a map of the entire territory, with dozens of parcels marked in different colors. A key in the corner explained the code. Red for properties already stolen through forged deeds. Blue for properties targeted for future theft. And yellow for the conspirators' own holdings, the empire they had built on lies and blood. The scope of their greed was staggering. They had stolen or targeted nearly half the territory, but it was the last marking that made Billy's blood run cold. His own small ranch, the one his father had left him. It was colored red, and beside it, a date. Last week. They hadn't sold him the barn as part of their scheme. They sold it to him because they planned to kill him there, just like they had killed his father. The barn wasn't a piece of property. It was his grave. He stuffed his father's notebook into his shirt, alongside the other documents. The evidence was complete now. It was undeniable. Enough to see every last one of them swing from a rope. But evidence didn't mean a thing if he died in this tunnel beside his father's bones. He crawled back through the narrow passage, his mind racing. The voices from the other tunnel system were more agitated now. They had searched every passage and found nothing. "He's got to be somewhere close," Sheriff Morrison was shouting. "A man doesn't just vanish into thin air." "Maybe he heard us coming and rode off," suggested another voice. "His dog's still here," Reverend Hollis pointed out, his voice grim. "A man like Thatcher doesn't leave his dog behind. Not unless he's dead, or he's planning to come back for it." Billy climbed out of the second entrance, pulling the heavy wooden cover back into place. The sun was low in the sky now, casting long shadows across the land. The shadows would provide cover, but time was against him. Once full darkness fell, 5 armed men hunting one would have all the advantages. He looked toward the barn. The guard by the horses had grown complacent, his attention fixed on the main tunnel entrance, where he expected the search party to emerge. The other 4 men were still underground. Billy's dog saw him. Copper tensed, every muscle in his body poised to bark a greeting. Billy held up a hand, a sharp, silent command to stay quiet. The dog obeyed, remaining silent, but his tail gave a single hopeful thump against the dirt. The rope around his neck was tied to the fence post with a simple slip knot. If Billy could just get to it, he could free the dog without a sound. He started to move, a shadow among shadows. He picked up a handful of small stones. With a flick of his wrist, he sent them skittering across the far side of the barn's tin roof. The sudden clatter made the guard jump. The man drew his pistol and crept around the building to investigate the noise, his back now turned to the horses and the dog. It was the opening Billy needed. He moved fast, staying low to the ground, his footsteps silent in the dusty soil. He reached the fence post just as the first of the men, Reverend Hollis, began to climb out of the main tunnel. The knot came free with a single pull. Copper was smart enough not to bolt. He stayed right where he was, as if still tied, until Billy gave a soft whistle. Together, they melted back toward the rock outcropping where Billy had first escaped. They had to get to those horses. "Spread out!" Morrison commanded as he emerged from the tunnel. Check the house, the creek, anywhere a man can hide, and find that dog. If we find the dog, we find him." But Billy was already at the horses. The guard was just rounding the far corner of the barn when he spotted them. The man's eyes went wide. He let out a yell that echoed across the property. "He's here! By the horses!" There was no more time for stealth, only speed. Billy vaulted onto the back of the nearest horse, Sheriff Morrison's powerful gray mare. The animal was startled, but steady. Copper, without a moment's hesitation, leaped up behind him, his claws scrambling for purchase on the saddle leather. "There he is! Get him!" The guard was running toward them, fumbling to aim his pistol. Billy kicked the mare into a full gallop, leaning down from the saddle to slap the rumps of the other 4 horses. They panicked, scattering in every direction, their reins flying. The conspirators would have to catch their own mounts on foot before they could even think about giving chase. A gunshot cracked the air, then another. Bullets whizzed past Billy's head. He pressed himself low against the mare's neck, urging her toward the line of trees along the creek. "Get the horses!" Morrison bellowed behind them, his voice raw with fury. "Don't let him get to town!" But Billy had no intention of going to town. The sheriff, the banker, the preacher, who could he possibly trust there? He was on his own. He guided the mare east, toward the territorial capital. It was a hard day's ride, but there he might find a federal marshal, someone outside the conspiracy's reach. The mare was fast, but she was carrying double, and the day had been long. Behind him, he could hear the shouts of the men as they managed to wrangle at least some of their scattered horses. The pursuit was on. He pushed the mare harder, the wind whipping at his face, the precious papers a constant reminder of what was at stake. It wasn't just his life anymore. It was his father's legacy. It was justice for dozens of families. He had to make it. Billy reached Miller's Creek just as the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. The mare was lathered in sweat, her breath coming in ragged bursts, but she hadn't faltered. Copper jumped down and lapped eagerly at the cool water. Billy slid from the saddle, his own legs unsteady, and let the horse drink. The sound of hoofbeats followed them, closer now. 3 riders, pushing their mounts hard. Morrison had caught up with Whitmore and one of the others. Their horses were fresher, their burden lighter. They were gaining. Billy looked at the terrain ahead. The creek bed offered a direct path east toward the capital, but it was open country. They'd be able to see him for miles. The other option was to head north, into the rocky, broken Badlands. It would be slower going for everyone, but the jagged hills and deep gullies offered something more valuable than speed. Cover. Copper finished drinking and looked back, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog could hear them closing in. Billy made his choice. He swung back into the saddle and urged the tired mare up the steep creek bank, heading north into the rough country. The mare stumbled on the loose rock, but found her footing. The ride became a punishing, jarring effort, picking their way through a maze of stone and shadow. Behind him, he heard Morrison's shout carry across the twilight. "He's heading north, into the rocks. Split up again. Whitmore, you follow the creek in case he doubles back. Jenkins, you're with me." They were adapting, trying to box him in, but by splitting up, they were also weakening their numbers. Now it was 2 against 1. Morrison was a skilled tracker, but he was also a man blinded by greed and panic. He was making the same mistake he'd made with Billy's father, underestimating his opponent. The documents in Billy's shirt felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. His father's notebook wasn't just proof of their crimes, it was a testament to his courage. Suddenly, Copper went rigid, his hackles raised. Billy followed the dog's gaze. 2 riders, silhouetted against the last sliver of daylight on a ridge half a mile behind them. Morrison and Jenkins. And they were closing the distance fast. Desperation made them dangerous, but it could also make them reckless. Billy had one last advantage, a secret his father had shared with him years ago. He had grown up exploring this territory, learning its hidden paths and forgotten places. Less than 2 miles ahead was an old, abandoned mine shaft. To anyone else, it was just a hole in the ground. But Billy knew its secrets. He'd explored its tunnels as a boy, mapping every passage, every dead end, every exit. Morrison might be able to trap him in a hole, but he didn't know it was a hole with 3 ways out. He urged the mare into a stumbling trot, the animal responding with a last, heroic burst of energy. They reached the mine shaft just as Morrison and Jenkins crested the last ridge. The entrance was a dark maw in the side of a hill, partially hidden by a rock slide and overgrown with thorny bushes. Billy slid off the mare and led her into the shadows of the entrance, copper sticking to his heels like glue. He tied the horse just inside, where she couldn't be seen, then took the precious documents and his father's notebook deeper into the main tunnel, hiding them securely under a pile of loose rock. Even if he didn't make it out of this, the evidence would survive. Outside, Morrison's voice echoed off the rocks. "Tracks end here. He's gone in the mine." "It could be a trap, Sheriff," Jenkins said, his voice nervous. "Only one way to find out," Morrison snarled. "You watch this entrance. I'm going to circle around. Make sure he doesn't slip out some back way." Billy allowed himself a grim smile. Morrison was thinking 1 step ahead, but he was still 1 step behind. While the sheriff searched for a rear exit that didn't exist, Billy was already moving down the eastern passage, a narrow tunnel that would let him circle around behind both of them. He moved through the familiar darkness by memory, his hand on the damp rock wall, copper padding silently beside him. The eastern exit was a narrow fissure in the rock, emerging behind a cluster of massive boulders. It gave him perfect cover and a clear view of his pursuers. Jenkins stood guard at the main entrance, his rifle held at the ready. Morrison was 50 yards away, scrambling over the rocks, searching the hillside for another opening. Billy drew his knife. He could take Jenkins from behind, but that wasn't the plan. He needed them alive. He needed them to talk. Dead men couldn't testify against the banker and the preacher. Instead, he put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a sharp, piercing whistle. The sound ricocheted off the canyon walls, seeming to come from every direction at once. Both men spun around, rifles up, trying to pinpoint the source. In that moment of distraction, Billy slipped from his hiding place and raced, silent as a ghost, to their horses. With 2 quick slashes of his knife, he cut the cinch straps on both saddles. The next time they tried to mount up in a hurry, they'd find themselves dumped unceremoniously on the ground. He ducked back into cover. "Come on out, Thatcher!" Morrison yelled, his voice echoing. "You're trapped. Give it up now and we'll make it quick for you." Billy's reply came from a completely different direction, from above and to their left. "The only one who's trapped here is you, Morrison. The federal marshals are on their way. I sent word before I ever came to the barn." It was a complete bluff, but it was enough. The lie, spoken with absolute confidence, rattled them. Both men instinctively turned toward the sound of his voice, exposing their backs. That was all he needed. Billy burst from cover and slammed into Jenkins from behind, using the pommel of his knife on the base of the man's skull. Jenkins crumpled to the ground without a sound. Morrison spun around, firing his rifle wildly. The shot went wide, the bullet screaming off the rocks. Before the sheriff could work the lever for another round, Billy was on him. The fight was short and brutal. Morrison was a bigger man, fueled by rage and desperation. But Billy was younger, faster, and fighting for something more than just his own life. They rolled in the dust, grappling for the rifle. Billy drove his knee into the sheriff's gut, knocking the wind out of him, and wrenched the weapon free. He brought the stock of the rifle down hard, and the fight was over. When the dust settled, Morrison lay unconscious beside his deputy. Billy tied them both securely with their own ropes. 3 days later, he rode into the territorial capital, not as a fugitive, but as a lawman of his own making. He had 2 prisoners in tow and a full, signed confession he'd beaten out of them during the long, uncomfortable ride. The federal marshals listened to his story. their faces shifting from disbelief to astonishment as he laid out the deeds, the letters, and his father's notebook. They dispatched a full company of riders that very day. One by one, the conspirators were rounded up. The banker, the preacher, the landowners, all of them were brought to justice. The barn Billy had bought for $1 had cost him everything he thought he knew about his past, but in its place, it had given him something far more valuable: the truth. It had brought justice for his father and returned the land to dozens of families who had lost all hope. His life would never be the same, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like his own. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the Old West. And if you really want to support the channel, consider hitting that super thanks button. Every little bit helps us keep these stories alive. Your support means the world to us.